Greetings, Michigan educators, and welcome to the Michigan Department of Education's Teaching Comprehensive History webinar series. My name is Precious Boone, and I'm the Director of the Office of Administrative Law with the Michigan Department of Education. NDE encourages teachers to lean in to teaching rich and diverse history of our state, country, and world. We hope that this presentation you will see today will provide you with additional perspectives, knowing that as educators expand their knowledge, you will be better equipped to create lessons that will help students meaningfully engage with history. We are proud to work with institutions of higher education, cultural centers, and the Confederation of Michigan Tribal Education Departments to bring research and expertise directly to Michigan educators. Today, we are grateful to welcome back Dr. Nakia Parker, who will share the rich history of civil rights and equal rights. This is the third session on this topic, and having seen the prior sessions, I can confidently say we are all in for a treat. We truly thank Dr. Parker for sharing her expertise and resources with all of us. And we also thank you, our Michigan educators, for your interest, participation, and willingness to expand your knowledge and your students' understanding of this important topic.
Teaching Comprehensive History webinars are intended to lift the knowledge of educators so that in turn you may provide opportunities for students to inquire, think critically, and explore history from multiple perspectives you may have not heard before. As you listen today, you are encouraged to consider how this content and perspective could be incorporated to enhance learning in your community. It is my pleasure to reintroduce Dr. Nakia Parker, Assistant Professor in the Department of History of Michigan State University. Go Green. Her research and teaching interests include slavery, African American history, and Native American history. She is currently finishing her first book, Trails of Tears, Lives of Bondage, Black Life and the Limits of Kinship in Indian Slave Country, 1830 through 1866. Which examines the lives of people of African descent in the Choctaw and Chickasaw Nations who were enslaved. Dr. Parker's research has been published in several academic and public history mediums, including the Journal of African American History and the New York Times bestseller 400 Souls, A Community History of African America, 1619 through 2019. Welcome, Dr. Parker.
Thank you, Scott. And it's so nice to be with everyone again for this final presentation. So I will get right to it. So for this week's presentation, we will talk about a pivotal time in U.S. history that perhaps we don't learn as much about. I know I didn't learn as much about Reconstruction when I was in school. I think now schools are making more strides to learn about this time period. It's an extremely important one. The Reconstruction era or Emancipation era was critical for Black Americans. And I wanted to start off with this picture from a political cartoonist, a pretty famous one named Thomas Nast, who wrote during the mid to late 19th century, as well as drew political cartoons. And in 1863, and then he does an updated image in 1865, he created an image called Emancipation of the Negroes, Present and the Future. And he's showing what he views as the promise and reward of emancipation. To the left, we see Black people's lives during enslavement. He shows pictures of violence, being sold on the auction block, endless labor. And then towards the middle and the right is Nast's vision of what Black life would look like in freedom, families joined together, being able to vote and be involved in politics, economic autonomy. And so today, what I'll discuss is, was this fulfilled? How did Black people go about reconstructing their lives after the Civil War and after slavery? Really, Reconstruction is an apt term. right? It describes the dozen or so years after the Civil War, after emancipation, when the nation is starting over, beginning to reconstruct and build itself again from the ashes of a devastating war. So what we'll also think about during this presentation and what I'll cover are these ideas and think about these questions as I present the information. Common theme as we spoke about the last two presentations. What kind of practices, institutions, and organizations did now freed people develop to ease their transition to freedom? During the Reconstruction period, what kinds of opportunities were available for the formerly enslaved? Where did they seek their freedom? How did they enact it in places in the West as well as the North? And then also I want you to think about, what is your assessment of this time period? What do you think about when you have to teach it, learn about it, read about it? There's been a lot of historical talk about this period, whether it was ultimately a failure, or can we look at Reconstruction more for the gains that took place? And so when I end the presentation, I'll come back to that question. And here, just a brief overview of what I'll discuss of how the lecture will look. So I'll talk a little bit about the Civil War, Black people's participation, and the important celebration of Juneteenth. I'll talk about three important aspects of the Reconstruction era for Black life. And then I'll finish by talking about Reconstruction in the northern states and the western states, and the end of the era and its legacies. So almost 200,000 Black men, 179,000 Black men served in the US Army during the Civil War. They were known as the US Colored Troops. And when I say this number, oftentimes the students that I teach are surprised it's that many. Because when we think about different memorials, documentaries, movies, books about the Civil War, there aren't too many about the efforts of Black soldiers. One in particular that was memorable was the film Glory in 1989 that had Matthew Broderick as well as Denzel Washington and Morgan Freeman. Denzel Washington won his first Oscar portraying a Black soldier. And that was a movie about the first Black regiment that was created, the 54th Regiment that was created in Massachusetts. Once allowed to participate, Black men eagerly joined the Union to fight. But this does not mean that they were automatically accepted as equals. First of all, they were prevented from being enlisted for a while, in particular because military leaders and the president at the time, Abraham Lincoln, was concerned that to allow Black men to serve in the Union Army would alienate the border states that allowed slavery, like Maryland, like Missouri. They didn't want to alienate them. They were loyal to the Union, but they were slave states. And so he resisted, Lincoln and military leaders for a while resisted this call. But with the actions of enslaved people, Black men, women, and children running to Union lines, providing valuable information, with Black leaders such as Frederick Douglass actually visiting Abraham Lincoln and encouraging him to allow Black men to vote and to make the war's primary objective about slavery, and to help Lincoln realize that, eventually Black men were allowed to participate. They did not receive equal treatment. They were segregated. The US Army and military forces are segregated until Harry Truman's presidency. He is the president that finally desegregates the armed forces. They also receive lower pay. They receive only $10 per month, as opposed to white soldiers who receive $13 per month. They're disproportionately signed to labor tasks rather than combat. And until the very end of the war, they could not rise above the rank of commissioned officer. In general, most Black soldiers were not treated as legitimate prisoners of war by the Confederacy. Even if Black soldiers surrendered, many times they were still shot on sight. They were not allowed quarter. And yet we still see almost 200,000 men joining the effort. And it was not only men, Black women also contributed to the war effort as well. I'd like to show, have posted a link of someone named Lucy Higgs Nichols, who escaped with her daughter Mona in 1862 to Union lines. And she eventually became a nurse. She eventually learned to read and then helped other Black folks learn to read. And just think about the dangers for her, fleeing as a mother with her child during the Civil War. Wartime is always a time of extreme risk. So you can imagine as a young Black woman having to flee, walking for days, not knowing who you'll encounter during your trek. Took a lot of courage. And yet Lucy Higgs Nichols and others like her served the Union forces. By war's end, approximately 200,000 Black women, as well as men and children, served the Union forces in some non-military capacity, whether they served as carpenters, wagon drivers, nurses like Nichols, spies like Harriet Tubman, all contributed to the war effort. So now I'll talk a bit about this now federal holiday, but actually celebration that's been celebrated by African Americans a century and a half before it was made a federal holiday in 2021, Juneteenth. How does Juneteenth connect to the end of the Civil War and emancipation? Well, Juneteenth commemorates the day that enslaved people in Texas, and historians think that there were about 250,000 people enslaved in Texas by 1865. June 19th is the day that they received official word that the Emancipation Proclamation existed and that they were emancipated. So 2 years after the passage of this document, it was announced formally in Texas. Many reasons for that. Texas was one of the most westernmost areas of the Confederacy. Not many Union troops were sent there. And as you know, with the Emancipation Proclamation, a lot of people, most people in the Confederate States didn't recognize it. It was a wartime strategy. They didn't recognize Lincoln as their leader. So they weren't even making, when he made this proclamation that enslaved people were free in states that were in opposition to the Union, they didn't recognize him anyway, right? This is more of a moral strategy as well as a smart military strategy as well. So what happens? So on June 19th, Union General Gordon Granger rides into Galveston. He reads the Emancipation Proclamation as well as General Order Number 3 that says that Black people were now emancipated. And the exact words were, "The people of Texas are informed that in accordance with a proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free." This proclamation was also put in newspapers and posted in public places. And the first celebrations of Juneteenth, as you can see, the date is June 19th, therefore Juneteenth. The first celebrations happened pretty early as 1866, in places like Austin, Houston, Galveston. And not only are these joyful occasions, as you could see to the left, people got dressed up in their best attire, there were barbecues, but there were also sermons, there was also political activity. People were encouraged to vote. They were encouraged to be involved in local and state politics. And the holiday continued to be celebrated in places like Texas, but also in some northern states as well. One notable Juneteenth celebration occurs in 1968 during the Poor People's March campaign headed by Martin Luther King. And he also decides to hold a Juneteenth celebration. But I would say national consciousness about this holiday, Juneteenth, is really not raised until the murder of George Floyd. And then with the conversations and debates about the need for a national reckoning with the legacies of slavery, we see now this passage of a federal holiday in 2021, Juneteenth. And MSU had its own first Juneteenth celebration, inaugural in 2021 as well. I wanted to give you a little background about this because in the next few minutes, we're going to talk about other aspects of freedom and emancipation. Black people celebrated emancipation, but that doesn't mean that they forgot about what life was like in slavery. War is over. 4 million people in 1865 are released from bondage. How did they react to freedom? We know they celebrated, right? We can see that with Juneteenth. But how else did they react? Well, we have some of their reactions recorded, as well as photographs of some former slaves because of a government project in the 1930s, spearheaded by President Franklin D. Roosevelt, called the Federal Writers Project. And I provided a link so that you can actually go to the website on the Library of Congress, where you could look at some of these pictures for yourself, as well as read some of these stories. So approximately 2,300 African Americans were interviewed in the 1930s as part of this Federal Writers Project. It was one of the many work relief programs established under FDR's administration. Interviewers talked to people in over 17 states between the years of 1936 and 1938. And FDR wanted to collect oral histories of slavery. He wanted to preserve the memories of the last living generation of people who either experienced or were familiar with slavery, like had mothers, fathers, aunts, cousins enslaved. And this project created the largest collection of narratives about the institution of slavery in the United States. It gave Black Americans an unparalleled opportunity to describe in their own words what their life was like under the yoke of enslavement and what freedom looks like. I highly recommend taking a look at this Library of Congress website. I think it's a wonderful website to use in the classroom. You can look at photographs, you can read some of these narratives. Some were even recorded and you can listen to them. It's a great primary resource. One of the people that was interviewed was Felix Haywood. He was enslaved in San Antonio, Texas. And when interviewed, he was asked, how did you know the end of the war had come? And he said, well, first of all, hallelujah broke out. Everyone was on golden clouds singing hallelujah. So as you can see, Haywood really eloquently describes the joyousness of the occasion. But he also describes other reactions too. He said that formerly enslaved people had a jumble of emotions, shock, uncertainty. He says this, nobody took our homes away, but right off, colored folks started on the move. They seemed to want to get closer to freedom, so they know what it was, like a place or a city. And I really think this is a poignant quote from Felix Haywood. As you probably can imagine, as Haywood testifies, most freed people weren't very interested in staying with people who enslaved them. They wanted to experience freedom. He says they wanted to get closer to freedom. What does that mean? Black people were free, but most of them went into freedom with nothing of material significance, maybe just the clothes on their back. Most formerly enslaved people had no land and very few belongings. They and their ancestors had labored for generations, centuries, without any recompense or benefit. And the Union Army and federal government does not enter the war at first with the intention of emancipation. That happens later. Therefore, at the end of the war, and also with the death of Lincoln, the government doesn't have a strategic plan in place for the future of the now freed enslaved people. So freed people would have to do much of this work and create new lives of their own. Black people had their own freedom dreams of what their lives should look like after emancipation. And I wanted to highlight Felix's example to highlight that when the Civil War ended, Black Americans in the South were joyful, but they also faced a momentous undertaking. The war and the end of it marked a period of profound transition as Black Americans went from slavery to freedom, and they took up the task of building new free communities. So let's talk about one aspect of emancipation and Reconstruction: freedom and family. One of the most shameful and violent aspects of slavery was the domestic slave trade, the breakup of families, selling family members away from one another. Reuniting families separated by slave sales and by the confusion the war caused, because many thousands of enslaved people in the South ran from plantations to Union lines. So reuniting family members was a crucial first step in the lives of newly freed men and women. And remember Felix Haywood and what he said. He said many people wanted to get closer to freedom. And for many Black Americans, they define freedom by the ability to move about and find lost loved ones that they had lost in slavery and reunite. Think about what that means, though. When people go missing today, think about all the technology we have to find them. We have photographs, phones, social media, TV, right? We have so many methods to get the word out. What did free people do in 1865? What if you were a parent and your child was sold away from you? During the domestic slave trade, sometimes enslaved people were a month old when they were sold away from their family. So what if you had a child that was sold away from you? Now that child is a teenager or young adult, and all you have is possibly the mental image of them when they were young. Same thing if you were a child. How do you identify your parents? Most people were sold multiple times. People that were enslaved were sold generally between 3 and 4 times during their lifetime. And each time they were sold, their name changed. How do you find people? It's a hard task, practically impossible, but yet freed people decided to undertake that task. In an effort to reestablish their families, they relied on word of mouth, letters, they traveled long distances, they searched for relatives in contraband camps and on plantations. They asked for the help of churches, of missionaries, government agents, and they took out ads in the newspapers. Formerly enslaved people took out ads in newspapers to find their relatives. I've shown you a picture here and also provided a link that is also another wonderful resource, the website called Last Seen: Finding Family After Slavery, that has gathered over 1,000 ads and counting of formerly enslaved people looking for their family members. Putting an ad in a newspaper required time, effort, money. Remember, free people didn't have much to begin with. Some newspaper editors were nice and they placed ads for free. Others charged, especially if the person was not a regular subscriber. But newspapers was one of the best ways to try to locate someone. If a lot of people read it, it's the best hope to reach a wide audience and perhaps reach someone who knew some sort of information about your family member. And the ads look like this: information wanted, or another title was lost friends. Sometimes the ads had an image of a horizontal hand with an index finger pointing at it, so it was easily spotted in newspapers. The ad generally ran for a month, sometimes more. Sometimes a person, with the help of perhaps missionaries or government agents placed ads in more than one newspaper. Many of these ads were placed in the South, but they were also placed in states like here, Michigan, the Dakota Territory, Montana, sometimes even as far away as Canada. It shows you the lengths people would go to find their families. It also shows that the loss of family was a heavy emotional weight on African Americans during the Reconstruction era. They didn't forget the loss of kin. They longed to be reunited with members of their family, and memories of family separation during slavery lingered decades after it ended. Some ads even were placed in the early 1900s. Most searches were unsuccessful. As you can imagine, the challenges were insurmountable, but sometimes there was happy endings. Like this ad on the Last Seen website in 1889. You can see with this ad, Maria, Mrs. Maria, looks like cow milled or carol mined. 30 years had passed since she had seen her family, but reunited with her mother and family after 30 years. It's like it's Mrs. Calmickle. Mrs. Calmickle is very happy at the discovery and will soon visit them. Imagine the joy, but also the emotions of being reunited. And I think that's one of the things that we might not consider when we think about Reconstruction, of the emotional impact and the impact on families. And somehow, against all odds, family members could unite. But of course, as you all know, where there's family, there's also drama. And there's no exception with that during Reconstruction as well. So during slavery, marriages between enslaved people were not legal, even though enslaved couples who were not separated by sale oftentimes did enjoy good relationships and sometimes lasting relationships. It's no surprise then, after emancipation, that there was a movement among the Black community to legalize marriages. In the South, Black couples sought to legitimize their unions in the eyes of God, of the Christian church, and according to the law. In fact, in 1866, for example, in 17 counties in North Carolina, 9,000 marriages were registered. Marriages that were recognized by the court also was an economic help, because families of Civil War veterans could receive pensions to support their family, and they could only do this if they were married. But as I mentioned, there's family drama. What happened if you were sold away from your marriage partner during slavery? You were forced to be with someone else. And then after the war, the former spouse was alive and came back. So now you had two mates, right? Drama. So some people had to choose between an old and a new spouse. We have one story where one freed woman decided to give her old husband and new husband a 2-week test run. She gave the old husband 2 weeks, lived with him, the new one 2 weeks, and then decided who she'd marry. Another woman resumed a relationship with her first husband, but then the second husband, who was much older, came back. Well, the couple decided actually to take him in as a poor relation. Whatever worked, right? Extended family. Sometimes there were even child custody battles and divorces. Not all couples wanted to stay together, even if they had managed to stay together during slavery. Sometimes during their marriages, there were instances of physical abuse and contention. So it wasn't just rosy family reunions. It's complicated. Nevertheless, the Black family unit and reuniting it was an important social aspect and undertaking of Reconstruction. Another important aspect is religion as well as education. I would say that second only to the family, the Black church emerged at this time as one of the most significant and influential institutions within the Black community. Now, as I mentioned in my first presentation, Black Christianity and free Black churches were always a force in the North. But the Black church in the South was called the invisible institution during slavery because enslaved people were not allowed to worship freely in the style that they wanted. They were forced to worship, at least outwardly, according to white slaveholders' ideas of Christianity. They would emphasize certain parts of the New Testament that said that slaves had to be obedient to their masters. And it's that type of Christianity that in some of the slave narratives that I talked about last week, particularly Frederick Douglass's, that is spoken out against. Frederick Douglass was a Christian, but in his narrative, he vehemently spoke out against the hypocrisy of certain white slaveholders who claim that they love God and were Christians, and yet after church service, they would go home and physically abuse and do worse to enslaved people. He pointed out that hypocrisy. And so now in freedom, when Black people in the South could worship openly in the way they wanted, they established hundreds of independent Black churches, left white churches by the tens of thousands. And the church was more than a place of worship. It was a place that housed schools, social events, political gatherings. In fact, over 250 ministers held some sort of political office during the Reconstruction era. Black churches pooled their resources and bought real estate. They promoted businesses, and they supported social programs as well that helped the needy. Many Black insurance companies and banks that were formed at the time were formed under the auspices of Black churches. And while Black men occupied generally the highest ranks in the Black Christian church, Black women also constituted a big part of it. In fact, they were the majority of the Black church's membership. They frequently raised money for the church. They taught Sunday school. They welcomed visitors, established social welfare programs, and were often viewed as church mothers. And this role, again, we have the church mothers, right? So they served welcoming, nurturing, but they also were politically active as well as socially active as well. And hand in hand with the Black church as an institution also is the institution of schooling, of education. After establishing churches, schools are one of the first institutions established in the South after emancipation. They're called freedmen schools, and they pop up all over the South. You can imagine, after centuries of slavery, Black people had a desire to learn to read, to write, to understand the world around them. They wanted to read the Bible. They wanted to prepare for the economic marketplace, and they wanted to participate in politics and knew that it was important to have an education to do so. Many Black churches funded these schools, as well as white teachers, missionaries, and philanthropists from the North. They even would come to the South to teach. However, by 1868, more than half of the teachers in Black schools in the South were African American, and most of them were women. And they viewed this role as teaching, not just as a job, but as a calling. They became important community leaders as well as inspirational role models and helped to build racial solidarity as well as community identity. And we can see the importance of education by looking at the significance of changing literacy rates in the Black community in the South. At the war's end, 90% of Black people were illiterate. By 1880, this figure drops to 70%, and by 1910, only 30% were illiterate. So freed people really embraced literacy and education as vital tools through which they could fortify their communities and open up opportunities for themselves, their families, and community members. And this leads me to discussing another institution of higher learning that was created after the Civil War that still has an impact today. HBCUs, or historically Black colleges and universities. So here I've given you some of the most famous colleges and universities and when they were founded. Most historically Black colleges and universities emphasize teacher training, but they also had a distinct vision of the type of training that would be most beneficial. So you had schools like Fisk and Howard and Spelman who felt that this classical liberal arts education would be the best type of education. Whereas you had other schools like Tuskegee, Hampton, who thought, well, maybe we should have more vocational training for Black students. This would really be the best to set them to economic autonomy. And so there were sometimes contentions, right, and different visions of what the role of colleges and universities were. Nevertheless, they were very important. And I gave you just a brief example of some people who we know today, very famous politicians, actors, Supreme Court justices, directors that went to these historic colleges. And just like in the past, as well as today, many of the people who attend, I would say probably most of the people who attend these colleges have offers from other places. They could go to Yale or Harvard or Princeton or Cornell, but they decide to go to these very important historic schools. They have a vital role in the Black community, and they have been around for over a century, really showing the importance of education during the Reconstruction era and beyond. So now let's talk a bit about another aspect that's important to understanding Reconstruction and the search for and struggles for Black rights, and that's land and labor. Before the Civil War ended on January 12th, 1865, Union General William Tecumseh Sherman goes to Savannah to meet with Black leaders. And it's out of these discussions, the famous Field Order 15 is created. And Sherman's question to them is simple. What do you need to be established in freedom? What is necessary? What is most important for freed people at this time? And these leaders respond, we need land. In fact, one person, Reverend Fraser, said the best way that we can take care of ourselves is to have land and turn it and till it by our own labor. And so Sherman asked, well, where do you want this land? Do you want it scattered? Sherman's words are this, quote, scattered among the whites, or do you want to be in colonies by yourselves? Fraser says, we would prefer to live by ourselves. We are afraid that there is a great prejudice in the South against us. And out of this extraordinary meeting comes Special Field Order 15, which confiscated private land of slave owners in South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida, and gave it to formerly enslaved people. Most people were given 40 acres, not all, but most were given 40 acres, and some of them were given tools as well as mules. This is where the famous saying, 40 acres and a mule, comes in. Thousands of people started to claim this land, more than 40,000. It was a radical plan of land redistribution. Some people even refer to it as an early example of reparations. However, when Abraham Lincoln is assassinated and his Vice President Andrew Johnson takes over, he revokes the order. Sherman certainly thought of it as a way to help freed people establish economic independence, and Black leaders did as well. And I often ask my students to think about how profoundly different, perhaps, things could be, the history of race relations, if there was some policy implemented that were able to help formerly enslaved people reestablish themselves economically, be able to be self-sufficient, to be able to pass on generational wealth. Of course, we will never know. What we see that happens is another federal agency put in place that attempts to help Black people economically, but also creates problems, and that's the Freedmen's Bureau. So I gave you a simple definition here. It's a federal agency created during Reconstruction to aid the transition from slavery to freedom. These were the various duties that they had, as you can see: settling marriage disputes, establishing schools, supervising and enforcing labor contracts. Notice there's nothing about land, helping them gain land. And that is not what the Freedmen's Bureau was about. They did help formerly enslaved people to sign and stay in labor contracts. And eventually, these contracts turn into what we now refer to as sharecropping. I gave you a brief definition here. It's an agricultural system that emerged during Reconstruction, in which a landowner contracts with a farmer or owner of land to work on a parcel of land in return for a share of the crop. It was essentially like a tenant-landlord contract. It bound Black people to the land, but also created an unequal power distribution and dynamic. Most landowners, farmers, were white. They were the ones who supplied tools, shelter, seed, farm animals to the Black person who was in this sharecropper contract. And generally, the white landowner was the person the sharecropper sold the crops to. But oftentimes, the person would not get paid back in money, but they got paid in credit. I'll give you more credit to buy more seed, more tools, more animals. Many times people were cheated and they stayed in debt. It was a vicious cycle. It eventually became a way actually to, as one historian put it, to enact slavery by another name. Sharecropping helps really motivate and an underpinning of what we call the convict leasing system, which is a system where prisoners are forced to labor. They're hired out to landowners or private businesses to generate income for the state. So even though the Freedmen's Bureau recognized marriages, they allowed free people to make contracts, they gave free people access to court. The court system was also integral in returning Black folks to situations of forced labor. So if, for example, if you couldn't prove that you were employed on some sort of farm property, you would be fined. If you couldn't afford the fine, which was usually a very high price, you would be sent to prison. And then you could be hired out to businesses to generate income for the state. In addition to the court system working against newly freed people, there also were other legal prohibitions put in place called Black codes. So even though slavery had ended, slave codes had ended. As early as December 1865, Southern states like Mississippi passed Black codes to curtail and regulate the labor and behavior of freed people. So for example, if a Black person was waiting for a train, sometimes they would be arrested for being what was considered vagrants. They're idling with no purpose. Black people weren't allowed to go to certain places, right? As we can see here, usually when we think of segregation and we think of Jim Crow, we think of these civil rights images where there are white fountains, white theaters, colored theaters. This actually started soon after the Civil War. With Black progress also comes backlash. So I've talked quite a bit about what Reconstruction looked like in the South, but this doesn't mean that Reconstruction didn't take place in the North and West too. So I want to talk briefly about that. So after the Civil War, approximately 100,000 Black Americans left the South to live in places like the North and West. And probably one of the most famous groups to live in the West that perhaps many of you are familiar with or have heard of are the Buffalo Soldiers. Black men who were veterans of the Civil War who served in the West in the 9th and 10th Cavalry of the US Army. About 25,000 men served in these regiments, and their main responsibility was the dispossession of native land and forcing native people on reservations. So they were sent to places, for example, where the Lakota Sioux, the Lipan Apache lived, and they had to dispossess them and put them on reservations. The indigenous people that encountered them called them Buffalo Soldiers in reference to their fearsome fighting abilities. The buffalo was a animal revered by many native groups, as well as their appearance. Buffalo's hair is a bit curly, it's dark, and that's how they saw the soldiers, with curly, dark hair, like a buffalo's mane. These soldiers, while they started new lives in the West, but they also faced discrimination and loneliness. Life was often difficult. They often were the ones sent out to the West, while white soldiers had a decision of where to go. Most people who were in the 9th and 10th Cavalry were forced to go to the West and forced to stay there. They didn't rotate stations. So it doesn't necessarily mean leaving the South was a paradise, right? They still faced discrimination. And of course, they faced hostility from indigenous groups. They're doing this work of settler colonialism. Nevertheless, some built lives in the West, and some soldiers even were awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. And I wanted to highlight this because it really shows the complexity of Reconstruction too. It shows that it's not just this black-white binary that Reconstruction exists in. And another aspect that shows how complicated Reconstruction is I'll tell you a bit about my work. What the Civil War looks like and the Emancipation era looks like in Indian Territory. There were actually Native nations who practiced chattel slavery, 5 in particular, with homelands in the South: the Creek, the Cherokee, the Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole, all sided with the Confederacy. Now, at the end of the war, each of these nations have to sign separate peace treaties with the United States because they're not considered a state, so they have to sign their own treaties. So that means that the 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery, doesn't apply in these areas. And in the Choctaw and Chickasaw Nations, slavery doesn't end legally until 1866. That's when their treaty is signed. And so we have stories on Library of Congress where enslaved people talk about being sold on the auction block in 1866 in these nations, in the area that we now know as Oklahoma. We even have examples when they applied for citizenship later on in the 1880s in these nations. And you can see these applications on Ancestry.com, where they mention being enslaved by indigenous people. So again, I wanted to briefly talk about that to show how slavery is complex, Reconstruction is complex, the fight for Black rights, indeed, is nuanced and complex. In addition to moving to places like Montana, like Iowa, there were also Black towns. Between 1865 and 1920, there were more than 60 Black towns created in Western states. And the people that moved there to places like Kansas and others actually had a name. They were called exodusters. One of the most famous areas that for Black towns was Oklahoma. When we think about the anniversary of the Tulsa uprising, it's the 100th anniversary in 2021. This was a Black town, a town that was created that had lawyers, bankers, teachers, successful towns. Black people, again, were on the move, trying to enjoy freedom. In the North, we also see the fight for equal rights as well. How it shaped up in the North was particularly looking for the right to vote and the right to share certain spaces. So the National Equal Rights League is founded in Syracuse in 1864. This was a league that promoted full legal and political equality, as well as economic independence, and also advocated for women's suffrage. You had people also like Harriet Tubman and Frances Ellen Watkins Harper that you see to the right that fought against segregation. They protested their forcible ejections from streetcars and wanted to desegregate them. So this just didn't start in the 1950s with Rosa Parks. There's a long line of political activism. They're fighting for schooling too. Sometimes they're fighting for integration, but there are others who are advocating for all Black schools with Black teachers. They felt that Black children would be best served having Black teachers. In general, voting opportunities are better in the North for Black men than in the South. Doesn't mean that in the South that they didn't vote, but there was definitely more violent confrontation about voting in the South. All these efforts from Black people paid off because the 15th Amendment is eventually ratified. It's contentious. Even in the North, there were places like New Jersey that rejected the amendment at first. New York had ratified it and then rescinded it. But eventually this amendment guaranteeing male suffrage is ratified. It's the fight over the right to vote that permanently splits the partnership between women's rights leaders and Black male leaders. Remember last week I talked about abolition and how it split because of the role of women's leadership in the movement, but yet you had people like Frederick Douglass supporting women's rights. Well, women's rights leaders like Lucy Stone and Lucy B. Anthony joined with Frederick Douglass to found the American Equal Rights Association and support universal suffrage. But then when Black men received the right to vote in the 15th Amendment, Stanton and Anthony pulled their support. They did not feel that Black men should get the right to vote over white women at first. And this is eventually what ends up splitting this, this partnership that had started before the Civil War. So now I just want to finish up by thinking about the legacies about Reconstruction. As you can see, we talked about land and labor. We talked about fighting for the right to vote, people serving as political leaders, also fighting against racial injustice. Reconstruction was a time when the Klan was broken under the presidency of Ulysses S. Grant. He passes the Enforcement Acts that gives federal government power to break white supremacist groups. It allows the president to use the army to fight against white supremacist groups that are now rampant in the South. And that's what happens. Grant does that. And for the time being, the Klan is destroyed. This peace, however, does not last. And an example of how racial tensions are still ramped up is in 1873, when there's a massacre in Louisiana called the Colfax Massacre. A group of armed white people come into a Black town. They actually bring a cannon. They are distressed that Black people are fighting for the right to vote. And in the end, over 150 Black men, women, and children are massacred. They are eventually put on trial and convicted, but later on their convictions are overturned. And to show you the relevance for today, for many years, a historical marker was put up, the one you see to the right, that was a memorial to this massacre. But as you notice, it talks about carpetbag misrule, which really carpetbagging was a a derogatory term for Northern people who they felt came into the South and stirred up Black people to cause trouble and to be politically active. This was a historical marker that was up for years, decades. It wasn't until 2022 that another memorial that you see to the left that was really helped, these two men here helped to create it, that showed the full story of the Colfax massacre and what happened and honored the people that were killed. These ideas of Reconstruction and some of its legacies, it's still potent today. So I just wanted to finish up by talking about the end of Reconstruction and thinking about that question. What is your take of this period? Reconstruction, formal Reconstruction ends in 1877 with the presidential election, and Rutherford B. Hayes is running against Samuel Tilden, who is referred to as a corrupt bargain. Rutherford B. Hayes promises that if people throw their support to him for his presidency, he will remove federal troops from the South. He wins, he removes federal troops. We see now political leaders take over that are hostile and violent toward Black rights. And it starts what many historians refer to as the nadir of Black life. We see the rise of Jim Crow, the rise of lynchings, as well as stopping Black participation in politics. It doesn't mean that Black people still didn't participate and fight, but it does show the lack of federal support for political participation in Black rights. So I wanted to stop there and end with this slide, some of the legacies and contemporary relevance of Reconstruction. And I hope that this has been helpful to you in talking about a little known time period that I think we should know more about.